Hi everyone, it's Kelly here. Please excuse my wet hair. I am fresh out of the shower and wanting to record for you today my November wrap up of all of the books that I read in the month of November. So let's get straight into it. The first book that I read, or I should say finished because I did begin it in the month before, was A Game for Swallows, To Die, To Leave, To Return by Zeina Abirached. This was a book I was reading for my Around the World book club. This was a book from Lebanon. It's a graphic novel. And I enjoyed the story. There were some elements of the graphic novel that really worked for me. I really loved the way that Zeina Abirached illustrated maps and sort of locations. I think she did that really beautifully. Some of the characters were beautifully fleshed out and had really interesting stories. However, I think because of the length, as in the short length of this book, I found it that it didn't really work for me as a graphic novel. And I do love graphic novels. There have been graphic novels that I have really enjoyed. So it's not that I don't like the format as a whole, but I just felt like there were too many characters in this story and we didn't get to know them enough. There were some that were really fleshed out and others, like the children who are the narrators of the story, you barely get to know them at all. So yeah, I think it also limited the depth of feeling that characters could show to one another, which I thought was going to be a strength of this story, because it is about a family who are living through a conflict in Lebanon, where there is daily sort of bombings and violence going on out in the streets, but they are sort of, and so it's the parents go to visit the grandparent, and then they can't get back. Their way back is blocked. So the neighbors in the complex in which they live, sort of like a little block of flats, basically look after the kids and keep their spirits up while they wait for the parents to return. So it's, a really interesting story. And I thought, based on that it was going to be this real kind of relationship between the children and the adults shown, but actually it sort of acted more like little vignettes of the lives of the adults in this story, which wasn't what I was expecting from this book. So I didn't hate it. I gave it 3 stars. I enjoyed it, but it didn't have the depth that I was looking for. So I think a longer format would have worked for me, but unfortunately for me, this didn't quite work. But I still would recommend reading it because it is, the illustrations are amazing. And also, some of those characters that you meet are actually quite lovely. So would recommend, but it didn't quite work for me format wise, unfortunately. So that was book number 1. Book number 2, let me just find a little spot where I can pop all of my books as I show them to you. The second book that I finished in November was Limberlost by Robbie Arnott. This is the second Robbie Arnott book that I've read this year. Earlier this year, I read The Rain Heron, which had been a book I thought I was going to really enjoy, which I did enjoy it, but it wasn't what I was quite expecting. I ended up giving it 4 stars, The Rain Heron. This book, however, I adored, and I gave it 5 stars. It was, I had a good old cry at the end as well. So you know it's worked when you've had a good old cry at the end of the book. Robbie Arnott writes so masterfully about the natural world. That is definitely one of his strengths. And also I think the main character Ned and his inner world, I think he has very masterfully written about as well. His sort of, confusion and the way he processes the events of the story, it's beautifully conveyed to the reader. I actually didn't read this physical copy. I listened to the audiobook, which was narrated by Zoe Carides, and I very much enjoyed it and would recommend it in that format because I think it worked really, really well. So very big recommendation from me for Limberlost. Limberlost is the name of a property, and we follow Ned as he sort of in his childhood. He is, I think, maybe a young teen at the beginning of the story. His brothers go off to war, and he's left behind because he's too young, with his sister and his father. And I can't remember what happened to the mother. I think she may have died. I think she died. Possibly not long after Ned was born, so he doesn't really have that relationship with the mother to sort of draw upon. So it's kind of like a family living on the land, trying to come to, to work around the limitations of having two sons away at war, and also trying to, in a time of scarcity, make things work. And so things are told from Ned's perspective, and he doesn't always understand the fullness of things. Things aren't always explained to him. So, he sometimes gets the short end of the stick and, makes mistakes and decisions based on that don't have the effect that he's intending. So, yeah, it was a really, really beautiful book, and I would recommend if you can get your hands on it. Right, after that, I read a book called The Magpie Wing by Max Easton. This is one of the books that I was reading for. It was longlisted for the Miles Franklin Award this year. Now, when I heard the title, The Magpie Wing, I don't know what I was expecting, but I certainly was not expecting football, aka rugby league, for those of us in Australia that know the difference between the different types of football that are played here. Rugby league, it's the old Magpies team that got merged with the West Tigers, well, what was the Balmain Tigers, and so they became the West Tigers. So it's sort of set around that period where that merger happened. So it was kind of like the dying days of the old West Magpies team. And yeah, so it actually, this book I think started off in a really interesting way. We follow a young guy called Walt and his sister Helen, and then their friend Duncan. So they sort of become friends through, the two boys become friends through joining their local level of rugby league team, and playing together. And that's sort of how the families kind of come together, and then everything just gets real complicated. Helen also is a really gifted player, but at that time there wasn't a lot of opportunity for girls. They were only allowed to play up until a certain age, and then there was no team for them, not even a women's team. There were mixed teams, and then it was, no, you're now at the point where it's just boys. So, it's sort of this kind of exploration of growing up in that era, sort of, I guess, 80s, 90s, 2000s, becoming an adult at that time in the 2000s, the early 2000s. And yeah, this started off really well, and it was quite interesting, and I was like, I'm surprised, but I'm not a massive football fan, but I know a little bit about football, and I was like, okay, this is actually quite interesting, and I thought I was going to enjoy this book. But then as it kind of moves away from the football and just kind of is about the lives of these three, Walt, Helen and Duncan, I feel like the book just kind of lost its way partway through, and it just never recovered, and I was left feeling mild frustration with all three of those characters, and wanting them just to grow up because they were carrying on like a bunch of idiots. So, it wasn't terrible, but again, it wasn't something that I will revisit. Unfortunately. I think I will look out for other books, I think, written by this author, because I believe this is a debut. I may be wrong about that. And I liked that this was a book about sort of Western Sydney and, not necessarily marginalised communities, but like definitely communities where, they're not the main part of Sydney, so they sort of don't get the same investment of infrastructure and so on. It's part of Sydney, but it's not, the kind of close to the city part. So it's, ends up becoming this almost separate thing, which is something that's definitely explored quite a lot in this book. So that aspect of things I liked. There were some really good passages in there. So I think Max Easton will be an author to watch, but for me, this didn't quite work. I ended up giving it 3 stars, so I didn't dislike it so much that I gave it below that. This definitely wasn't quite it for me, unfortunately. So that was that. Then I read a book I don't have a physical copy of. I listened to this one on audiobook, which I borrowed from my local library, and it is called Lapsed by Monica Dux. So this is a book about a self-described lapsed Catholic. And for me, this was a real eye-opener. So I would say Catholic adjacent, because I grew up in religion, so in a Protestant church. So I am familiar with religion from that point of view, but I'm married to a Catholic, and have, had sort of experience with Catholic people, but I guess I don't really understand, or didn't before I read this book, some of the aspects of things that, and also one of my grandfather, God rest his soul, was fairly anti-Catholic, and I had no clue why he had these attitudes, and this book kind of explored those sort of foundations of that rift between the Protestants and the Catholics. So that was, this book really does not hold back. She's quite critical of a lot of things, but also explores, and it's kind of quite personal as well. So this is, I guess, a memoir of sorts, but it's like a very specific aspect of the author's life that she's kind of exploring, and also kind of talking to other people in her family, and exploring some of those like kind of more, I guess, the seedy underbelly of Catholicism, and the kinds of things that have happened historically and presumably still happen also, although hopefully a lot less than they used to. This was a really interesting book. I gave it 4 stars. The reason I didn't give it higher than that is because there were some elements of this book that I thought she didn't actually have a grasp on, that she talked about as though she did, and that was more to do with when she was discussing things to do with Protestantism, and as I was reading those, I'm like, that's not accurate. Like, that's not actually how things work in the Protestant church. So she was kind of talking as though she knew about that, but didn't quite. That did not happen very often, because she was mostly focused on Catholicism. Obviously, that was kind of the whole point of the book. So I gave it 4 stars. It's definitely worth a read, and I would recommend it. It's really, really good. The next book that I read is called This Is Not a Book About Benedict Cumberbatch, by Tabitha Carvan. Okay, this was kind of a lot about Benedict Cumberbatch, and his name was mentioned so many freaking times that I was sick of hearing it, because I listened to this on an audiobook and I was absolutely sick of hearing his name by the end of this book. You know, it was an ordeal. The better parts of this book are about female joy and about loving what you love, or in this case, who you love. And sort of there were some really good points made about the perception of, you know, women's media, the ways in which women enjoy stuff being looked down on, and also women's propensity to relinquish things that make them joyful over time, you know, as we sort of are told to grow up. But the problem I had with this is, and I don't have a problem with, you know, women loving what they love, and whatever they love is fine. But Benedict Cumberbatch is a person, not a thing. And to me, I don't know whether, I mean, maybe this is in part just my conditioning, but I felt like putting myself into his shoes, how would I feel about that, you know, being loved in the way that is described in this book? I would feel really creeped out by it, to be honest. So I don't know, it just, I couldn't quite get on board with this, unfortunately. It wasn't terrible, the book, and as it did make some good points, I did give it 3 stars, but I just couldn't quite get on board with the focus of her love being a person and not a thing or like a hobby. You know, I think it's absolutely fine to find joy and to love, but if the object of that love is a person, I think there's a fine line that you have to walk. And I don't think this quite achieved it, unfortunately. Sorry. Okay. The last book that I read, excuse me while I turn my page, in my journal, which I'm just sort of reading from just to remind myself of my thoughts immediately after finishing each of these books. The final book that I read in November was Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. Again, I listened to an audiobook version of this, and the one that I listened to was on Scribd, which I subscribe to, and it was narrated by Jonathan Keeble. There are several, I think. No, possibly that was the only one that was on there, but just in case you're looking, I thought it was quite a good audiobook version. And I've written here, it was an excellent choice to choose audiobook, because this he does the voices, basically, because this book is about, this is nonfiction, so it's George Orwell, and he is as it is described in the title, down and out, as in he's doesn't have very much money. At times he's homeless. At times he is working, but the pay is very poor, and the conditions are horrific. This was the first book, I believe, that he published. So this was before he had a literary career. And it basically outlines his struggles just to survive and to, to earn enough money to live, and to eat. And at times he's not eating, or at least not eating very well, in this book. So he starts off in Paris, and he, works as, I forget what the name of it is, but basically he's like a kitchen hand, and he is, cleaning the pots and running general errands, etc., for the cook, in sort of what my understanding of it was, it's kind of like almost like a cafe within a hotel. So, or, you know, the kitchen of the hotel. So it wasn't a restaurant per se. It's sort of like the food element of a hotel that people come to stay in. Yeah, so that was quite interesting. Was an interesting kind of slice of life of what life was like at that time in that place. And then he goes back to London, and while he has a job lined up in London, but unfortunately when he arrives there's a delay, so there's like a couple of weeks where he has to he doesn't have money or accommodation, so he is homeless when he arrives in London. And that was really fascinating, learning about what they called the spike. So essentially it was a place that if you were a homeless person, if you needed somewhere to sleep for the night, it was an indoor place to sleep for the night, but it was almost prison-like. You kind of got locked up and were subjected to these horrific, like, you know, strip searches and things like for contraband and, you know, all that sort of thing. And it certainly wasn't a place of mercy. It was to keep people off the streets. So, and then they had these really strict rules around, you know, you couldn't stay there more than one night. So you would have to let them know which direction you were heading. And you weren't allowed to stay in the same spike. I think it was like every 30 days. So, you know, after 30 days you could come back. So essentially what it created was this group of mostly men who were homeless, who had to go on foot walking around, you know, the surrounds of London, so that they could stay in a different spike each night over a month. So any chance of you actually picking up work and things like that were so diminished because you weren't allowed to stay more than one day in the same place, you know, and you had to walk to the next place. So yeah, it just sort of ended up being this really horrible, you know, experience of just going around and around. And, you know, a lot of these policies that were around these spikes were, I would say, inhumane, you know, and certainly not based in charity. So it was really interesting. So it was you know, a slice of life of what it was like to be poor in the early 1900s. There was a lot of racism in this book as well, particularly anti-Semitism, though I don't necessarily think it was the opinion of the author in particular, but rather a reflection of the times and him kind of explaining, you know, the thoughts of other people and relaying what other people had said and so on. Although there were a couple of things in there that sounded like they might have been his opinion. So I don't know. And he seems like a really odd sort of fellow, George Orwell. So, you know, he's a really interesting kind of character as just a human being, and the way that he kind of reflects on things and approaches things. So yeah, this was really, really interesting. I gave it 4 stars, and would definitely recommend. All right, so that is my November. Here they are. I had a good reading month. This was, so I read 6 books, these plus the one that I don't have a physical copy of. Whoop. Not a good way to hold them. Yeah, and I enjoyed most of what I read this month, including my lovely 5-star book by Robbie, Arnott, Limberlost. Yeah, it was a good reading month. So I'd love to hear what you have been reading recently. Have you read any of these? Do you agree with my opinions on them? Would love to hear from you down in the comments. Bye.